Okay, we're on. We're on camera. What I wanted to tell you about was the difference between this airplane and that airplane. This is what I graduated from in 1940 at primary training. And 2 years later, I'm in command and staff school. I was pulled out of combat, out of the Caribbean, and brought back to the United States for some unknown reason. And I went to command and staff school. And I was only a first lieutenant in command and staff school at that time for colonels and above. But the war was on and they were bringing in young people into the system. But I had no idea what was ahead of me. When I graduated, it was a 6-week course. It was a crash course. Everything was a crash course in World War II. And when I graduated, I went back to Panama. And they said, you're going back to the United States on a special project. And I actually turned around and got on a ship. I flew down on Pan American Airlines, got on a ship, and spent 7 days coming back to San Francisco. And we ended up in Hays, Kansas. And all we knew is we were on some kind of special mission. Our whole unit, they just lifted our whole unit out of the Caribbean and sent it there. It was the 40th Bomb Group, one of them that's listed here. And we were briefed in the operations office that we were going to fly a new airplane that like nothing we'd ever flown before. We didn't know, we had no idea that we didn't even know this airplane was in development. And we were flying at that time B-17s and LB-30s and B-24s and B-18s, which were much smaller than this. And we had this briefing in this operation room, and there were about 10 of us, 10 pilots, and they took us out to this hangar, which was guarded at that time, and we walked in just like you walk in here. And I looked at this thing, and I said, holy Moses, they're going to fly this thing? You must be out of your mind. And the guy briefed us that he was a test pilot for Boeing Aviation. And he just sort of walked around and looked at it. We were all just, we were flabbergasted. I mean flabbergasted, because it was so much bigger than anything we ever flew before. And we didn't even know it existed. And he said, this thing flies like no other airplane you've ever flown. But it flies a lot like a B-26 bomber. And he said, you're going to have to go to B-26 school. So off to Del Rio, Texas, we went to B-26 school. And after 10 landings, they said, you're qualified. After 10 landings, they said, you're ready for whatever you're going to do. And I went back to Pratt, Kansas, and the Boeing test pilot checked me out in 2 hours and 15 minutes of flight time. 2 hours and 15 minutes. And he said, you can land the airplane. You're all right. The next thing I got was an order to go to Wichita, Kansas with a captain and a navigator to pick up a B-29. So somebody flew us down to Wichita, and here they had acres of these airplanes in construction in various stages. And they had a couple sitting out there, and they said, this is the first airplane that the Air Force has officially accepted for Boeing aircraft. And you guys are going to fly it away from here. So they got about 1,000 Boeing employees out in a big circle, and they broke a bottle of champagne on the nose wheel here. And I don't understand what that means. Oh, okay. They broke a bottle of champagne, and I was a first lieutenant, and the captain outranked me. But
Dad, you had 15 more minutes.
15 more minutes.
The captain said, you got 15 minutes more time than I have. You be first pilot. And that I was outranking a captain with 15 minutes more flying time than he had. I had 2 hours and 15 minutes, and he had 2 hours. So I flew the first airplane off, and we had this big crowd around, and we went to Pratt, Kansas, and I had no idea that this was the beginning of a 2.5-year episode and that it would be almost 2,000 hours later before I ever got back to the United States. So I ended up flying this wonderful airplane, and to me it's a wonderful airplane. And you'll hear people say that it was a killer, but if you flew it right and used your head, you could get through a lot of things. I came back from one mission with 400 holes in the airplane, with this engine over here completely out, gasoline spewing out the back end, and got back to Iwo in it. So it's a very sturdy airplane. We had some of them that had half of the tail knocked off, and it's still they were able to get back home. But I just want to tell you this. I really was trying to tell you the story of how impressed we were, or I was, and I'm sure all of us were, when we first saw this airplane in the hangar. And it's just like when you walk in here, it is bigger than life. And so that was my start. This with a great deal of concern, although you never found anything wrong. Maybe I found, in all the time I ever inspected an airplane, one time I found something wrong. But you'd start at the wingtip, and you would walk from the wingtip to the first engine. You'd look at the props, look at the one you could see and the rest of them, and you'd go over here and you'd go under the nacelle here and look at the landing gear, look at the tires to see whether there were any cuts in them or anything, and then you'd come around here and inspect the nose wheel, and you would wonder why. You could land this airplane and do a lot of damage if the landing was bad. They could land on the nose wheel, and you know what that means. You can stress that. That's a very delicate piece in relationship to the loads it takes. So you would look there to see whether there was any possible damage in the landing gear, and you would proceed around to that end of the wing, come around the back, come back up, and go in. But you would do this religiously. It made you feel better. It made you feel better. Even though there probably have been 20 people working on the airplane for the last 48 hours. But sometimes they left a nacelle, one, what do they call those things?
Hatch, covered.
The quick
Zeus fasteners.
Zeus fasteners, yeah. They'd leave one loose and you would discover it, and there were a lot of things that you could really pick up. But that was started a new system whereby you had a crew that you always flew with. You had the same crew every time you flew. You had your own bombardier, navigator, co-pilot, radio operator, radar operator, right gunner, left gunner, tail gunner. All 11 men flew as a crew, and you got to be quite a team. And my first crew, everybody named their airplane. They named their Jack's Hack, and it must be some connection with the Battle of Kansas. But our crew decided to name our airplane Miss Lace, and that was the heroine in a cartoon series that was based on operations in Burma during the late 30s and 40s. And she was quite a gal, and we got Milton Caniff was the cartoonist, and he painted a picture of her about this high and sent it to us, and then we had an artist paint it on the airplane. So we had Miss Lace here and her name underneath, and that was the name of our airplane. Everybody named their airplane something or other and had some insignia to go with them. A lot of them had to do with women. But these guys must have all been mechanics that flew this airplane. I was in the first group that ever flew these airplanes, and we flew them from India to China for all our missions. And we had to fly over the famous Himalayas, the hump, what was called the hump. And we put one camel for each time we went over the hump. So I have I think, 29 camels. You got a camel for each way across the hump. And then for each bomb mission, you put a bomb up there. And the thing about this airplane was not only a big airplane, but it was a quantum leap over anything else that we'd flown. And I had flown B-18, B-17s, LB-30s, B-24s, B-23s. And when this came along, you couldn't believe it. First place, it was pressurized. The very thing that all of us enjoy in commercial airline and begin to enjoy after World War II was you could fly at any altitude and get over weather and have the comfort of being at practically at ground level, 8,000 feet or under. When we were in test period on this, there's a story in several books about one of my flights, test flights. They had planned that this airplane could fly above any anti-aircraft and above most fighters. I'm going to have a drink. Tail gunner.
Here.
Radar operator.
Here.
Radio operator.
Here.
Navigator.
Here.
Bombardier.
Here.
Central fire control.
Here.
Co-pilot. Okay, everybody check in, ready to go. We're ready for takeoff. Where's the checklist? Well, we had quite a checklist to go through. The flight engineer was a pretty busy guy because he had all the critical instruments back there, cylinder head temperatures and cowl flap openings, and one of the things that was very critical on this airplane was cowl flap openings. And he has gauges there that he could see how open they were, and he also could look out that window and see whether they were working or not. But the testing of this airplane, our biggest problem in the early stages was that the engines overheated, and we had cowl flaps that were about that long. And so when your engine temperature would go up, we'd open up the cowl flaps. That would slow the airplane down 5 or 8 or 10 miles an hour, and that you'd have less flow through the engines, and they'd get hotter. So you'd open up the cowl flaps some more, and when you open up those big cowl flaps, they were tremendous drag for radial engines, aren't they, John?
He's not here.
Oh, he's not
We
here.
hope he did not.
Big problem with this airplane was these throttles. In order to go straight down the runway, you had to play them a little bit, and a lot of people were not very good with their left hand, and some pilots had a hard time being able to operate these throttles with their left hand. I was always kind of ambidextrous with it, so it wasn't a problem for me, but this was a real problem. And you had all kinds of controls here. My goodness, you had the elevator control and the flight control and the prop control, how fast the props were going, what RPM they were to go at, and you had a particular set RPM for whatever engine power you were running. And of course up here you had all the standard instruments that were standard on my airplane that I owned up until a few years ago. Airspeed meter and altitude and horizon and climb indicator and compass. But this was about the only instrumentation we had. On my private airplane, I had far more instrumentation than this airplane has in the form of radio after GPS came in, long before you guys got it in that you could carry in your hand. And but despite all that, and without all that equipment, I flew this airplane completely around the world, starting out in Kansas, going around through Africa, through India, China, Philippine Islands, the Marianas, Hawaii, and then the West Coast. And we did it without any really radio control. Did it all by dead reckoning navigation, which kind of seems impossible now because we were flying in parts of the world where there was very poor maps, and still finding our airport we were going to. But it's really kind of astounding that we flew from Pratt, Kansas to our first combat field, which was Paradova, India, in one of these things and landed them, and they told us to be careful of the elephants on the runway when we landed. So that was actually a joke. There weren't any elephants on the runway. And this pressurization system, my goodness, this thing's all piped up. Actually, this airplane was built considerably later than any that I ever flew. And the co-pilot sat over there on my right, and he was a great aid because he had to be at the ready for if anything happened. If your anti-aircraft flak seat didn't work and you got one up through your tail, he had to take over. The bombardier had a hell of a place to spend anywhere from 12 to 18 hours sitting down there in that little seat. And I think the only reason you could spend that much time cramped up like this was all filled up back there, was because you were young and agile. It's kind of amazing that you could spend, the longest mission I ever flew was 18 hours. And you'd once in a while get up and walk back to here, but that was about it. The front crew and the back crew stayed separated. Very, very seldom there was any mixing from one end of the airplane to the other, because everybody had a job. And we flew over enemy territory for long distances when we were in China, because Japan occupied about a quarter of China at the time, so we had to fly over enemy territory long before we ever got to Japan. And otherwise it was an extremely comfortable airplane because of the pressurization. Flying in at the altitude that we flew at a lot, at 20,000 feet, you'd have to wear, if you were in a B-17, you'd be wearing a mask and taking oxygen, and that wasn't very pleasant, and you were also colder. This airplane was very well heated, and I presume that some of these are tubes to bring in heat and pressurization up to critical points. Although I can see that was probably to defrost the window. Over Manchuria one mission, this complete thing got iced over, completely iced. You couldn't see out. You're flying purely by instruments with some kind of unusual phenomenon of weather that ices over. I remember it was 43 below zero.
And start.
So after you got all the crew checked in, you were ready to take off. You had 11 people on the crew, including myself. And this airplane was a very forgiving airplane in one respect, and a very dangerous airplane in another respect. But it could take a lot of damage, and it took me through 29 missions in this airplane, and I flew in the last mission of World War II over Japan, and in the first mission of World War II. The first mission happened to be on June 5th, the day that the Normandy invasion started, which was all a planned mission, that they hit Japan, the Empire, for the first time at the same time they landed in Normandy. And that was the first mission. It was on the Yawata steel mills in Yawata, Japan. And then I flew on the last mission, which was a show of force of 500 B-29s, which I led over the battleship Missouri in the Bay of Tokyo when the surrender was signed. And my target time was 8:17 in the morning which was a scripted time that MacArthur was to put his signature on the surrender agreement, and we hit that target exactly at the right time. General Ramey, who had assigned me to the job, said, "Fauché, this is one target time you better not miss," because MacArthur was a great guy on ceremony, and that's probably why we had 500 airplanes over the target for the show of force. And that also was not only my last mission over Japan, but my 116th combat mission, for which I netted 3 Distinguished Flying Crosses and 5 Air Medals and 16 citations. And actually I got one other flying cross from the Chinese, which would really make it 5 Distinguished Flying Crosses. But from the Americans I got 3. So luckily I outdid all my missions, and here I am still talking about it. Of the 11 men, the number up here was right up in front was the bombardier's position, very important position, and his job was principally to drop bombs, but he also had control of some of the guns to defend ourselves against fighters. Over on my right was a co-pilot, which was I was fortunate to have extremely good co-pilots. That my main co-pilot that I had became a command pilot on this side of the aisle later on after I graduated up into operation. Right behind the co-pilot was a flight engineer, and he had a lot of responsibility to keep track of all the engines.
How'd you like to have one of these?
Yeah, I'm surprised they went to the trouble to put a designation there.
I guess it was original equipment, but these were all stripped pretty quickly
Yeah,
as trophies. But a pretty simple panel.
yeah. This is we had almost this panel in that Stearman over there.
Exactly.
Yeah,
All the gauges are backed by with a flight engineer.
yeah.
You got the throttles. I guess
I don't know whether you heard me tell about these throttles. Did you hear me tell about
No.
the throttle? Some pilots who were not very ambidextrous had a hard time with the left-handed, this whole handful of throttles. See, the B-17 had the throttles here
in the center.
in the center, and you use these throttles, you could play them for keeping your airplane lined up, because you had a lot of leverage out there, and if you had one engine pulling a little more power than the other, you had to play these things. Some pilots had a hard time getting adjusted to that.
You just have to go back to the Stearman.
Actually, there were some pilots that never made the grade. They
just couldn't transition.
They couldn't play these throttles. I was always kind of ambidextrous. I could do almost anything with my left as my right, so it was never a problem to me. But
Yeah, I was an instructor for about a year, and you had to, on a Cessna, you had to go from left to right.
yeah,
You learn.
yeah, that's right. And they still had a gang switch here.
Mm-hmm.
You could run all
Those are mags? No.
you could run them all down at one or run them all up, so that, and then you would synchronize them individually by sound.
Yeah, it beat.
Yeah.
So how did you synchronize the engines? That's how you synchronize them?
That was approved for production before it was tested. And today and prior to that, it would take 3 to 4 years once an airplane was designed of testing before they would ever release production specifications. They released production specifications and it hadn't been tested. That's why we had so much trouble in the first year of this airplane. And that really, our mission when we first took over this airplane and the first groups was testing the airplane and finding out how we could use it. They didn't even really have a good plan on how to use this airplane. For instance, I flew on a test mission at 38,000 feet, and General Arnold called me, who was head of the Air Force at the time, called when I put in my report after we landed. He called and congratulated us on flying at 38,000 feet, and he wanted to know whether we made a successful bomb run, which we had. What he didn't realize that at 38,000 feet, we had about 10 miles an hour between cruise and stall. That's all we had.
Right on the edge.
You'd open the bomb bay doors and you'd go into a stall, and so you had to give it power, and it was nip and tuck. You could bomb at 38,000 feet. We could bomb at 30,000 feet. We found out, and hold a reasonable, because you have you have two kinds of conditions. One is when you open a bomb bay door. For the bomb sight to work, you had to have a stable platform.
Mm-hmm.
Constant speed, not turning and that sort of, and not changing altitude, anything. And when you open the bomb bay doors, it completely changed the air drag,
Characteristics.
the dynamics, aerodynamics of it. And we had to learn what to do. You know, your guide come back and say, well, I opened the bomb bay door and it dropped 10, 15 miles an hour, and then you say, well, okay, you got to have 10 miles an hour over your bombing speed, and when you're going to open the bomb bay doors, you open the bomb bay doors 2 minutes before the bombs fall out. But a big happening was we had electric operated bomb bay doors, and they were on motors, and you'd say, bomb bay doors open, and they'd go, and by that time you've slowed down 10 miles an hour, and the bombardier is yelling, I don't have a constant airspeed over the intermic. They put in air operated doors, and I'm sure this airplane has it. When you open the bomb bay doors, they went just like that.
Pneumatic system.
Pneumatic operated, and you close them the same way, so that the bombardier would get the airplane and the target on target, and he would open the bomb bay doors just before the bombs dropped, and before the airplane changed configuration. And that was what sounds like a little development, but it took a lot of development to arrive at that. I don't know whether you heard me tell about the cowl flaps. What a tough time we had with cowl flaps in the beginning. They were twice as long as these are, and when you open them up, they put on tremendous drag. Yeah. And that was one of the things that the flight engineer had to do, is keep the cowl flaps open while you were taxiing, and when you got ready for takeoff, just before takeoff, he would close the cowl flaps, and you'd take off, and then he'd start opening them up as the engine as he watched the gauges there and the temperature would go up, he'd open the cowl flaps up, but not so much that he'd pull so much drag that you. But when you opened up 4 engines with those big cowl flaps all the way, the drag on it was like putting a parachute out the tail. This airplane was fantastic because it was pressurized and you could smoke in it, and this was the important control. So you could smoke. You could put the cigarette out and control that. But that was a fact, is that this was almost like living in your living room. But a operator was. I had a fantastic crew. I'm the last one alive on my crew. My right gunner just died a month ago. He and I were holding down the fort. So I've got the last bottle of champagne to drink.
So who?
Carmona became head of controllers from everything from Los Angeles to the West Coast in his civilian life. Albert was an air.
So I wanted to ask you a question, Dad. What's the oxygen for?
Oxygen?
See that big tank? That looks rather...
This was an emergency bottle in case you depressurized at altitude.
For the whole crew?
No, this. I told you that a bombardier went back one time with a portable. This is what he took with him to go back into the bomb bay and check the fuses. But the radio operator had to stay in constant contact with home base, and so he never really got off duty for 12, 15, 16, 17, 18 hours.
In that little chair?
This is a big chair. Of course, he could get up and stand up every once in a while. But and Carmona became a well-known ham operator, ham radio, and then he became a controller for commercial aircraft, and then he graduated in the FAA to controller, manager for everything from Salt Lake City West.
Wow.
So he had a pretty big job.
Now, didn't you say this was the turret? So then he had to be sitting
Yeah.
over like that.
Yeah, he was cramped in here. Well, the navigator was too. He didn't have much room either. But
He had all his maps on this
yeah,
table.
he had a gun turret up here hanging down in here too. And
What's this?
I don't know. That's something that came in that came in later. It's probably a radar screen. And I am sitting here alive because of two different times I didn't think the navigator knew where he was. And it was a good thing I didn't think he knew where he was, or we wouldn't be here.
Fans are on.
What are you doing? Playing the Star Spangled Banner or something? Oh, yeah.
Can you get us in here waving to you?
Yeah, well, if you pan and get that, and you can do voiceover on the.
I was down in the Air and Space Museum 3 weeks ago. And, Noah Gay, which is the that is original. I mean, they China and Marianas. Here's at least the Marianas.
There's a good map here of where this earthquake was. This happened. See, they were almost at our base. See all those little rivers? That was the most fantastic thing. That became from the air, big lake. They would flood that thing in the spring with a rice bag. That's right in the earthquake. Our base was
I guess they give them
Ring.
rollers.
ring. How he went down there is he must have here. Well, he overshot and you went right up against the water.
It's the Indian place. It's the left one. Accentuated. And then there's 20. We used to work on the deal like grant.
back, 'cause we're getting an awful lot of patients here. 40